Thanks very much, Dale, and thanks, Gloriana, also for inviting me here today. I've really been fascinated by all of the projects that are underway that you're all doing, and I'm going to share with you a little bit of our work in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And I want to start just by telling you about the challenge that we're facing with trying to get information about this environment to the public in an accessible form. We work on species of birds that most people have never heard of. So shorebirds are things like plovers and sandpipers. They're familiar to some people from the seashore, but there's 74 species of birds like this ruddy turnstone, which you could see on any beach along the coast right now. Most people don't know that it comes from the Arctic, and they don't understand the issues involved with trying to conserve a bird that travels from one end of the earth to the other. So from the starting point, we have a big challenge trying to get information about these birds out to the public. We work in places that are so remote that most people will never go there. So working on birds that no one's heard of in a place that no one's ever going to go is a tough place to start. I want to start by telling you a little bit about the birds themselves, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work we do, and we'll wind up talking a little bit about the techniques we're trying to use to make those habitats and the birds accessible to the public. So I'm going to tell you a little bit first about the red-necked phalarope. This is a bird that's actually very common in New England, but most people who live in New England have never seen one. And that's because when it's here, it uses the offshore environments. So it nests in the tundra, but it comes to New England and stages in large numbers. There are about 2 million of these birds in the early 90s off the coast of Maine. If you go out there right now, our surveys show only about 4,000. So almost 2 million of these birds are missing. And it's a sort of a testament of how little we know about them, that we have no idea where they are. We don't know if they're dead or if they've moved somewhere else. So it's a major environmental conservation issue. What they do is hatch their young on the tundra. This is a juvenile red-necked phalarope, and it's getting ready to do something really remarkable that shorebirds do, which is head out for its wintering grounds without being shown the way. The adults of most shorebirds leave the Arctic very quickly. There's a lot of good reasons to do that. It's a harsh environment. It's a dangerous environment. So they leave as quickly as they can, leave their children behind. The children find their way on their own to their wintering grounds. The challenge for us is that we don't know where that might be. This bird could be headed for Peru, or it could be headed for Africa. And it's the 21st century, and we don't know which ocean to look for this species, of which most of the individuals are missing. The Earth is a big place, and they start up here in the Arctic and collect in the Bay of Fundy, and then head out either for this Southern Ocean or all the way around the other side of the world off of Africa or somewhere in between, and we literally do not know where to look. So we have major conservation and information challenges just to figure out where they're going. The other bird I want to tell you just briefly about is the American golden plover, another species you could see anywhere along the coast during fall migration, a beautiful bird that nests on the tundra. This is an adult, and like most shorebirds, they give birth to their young, cute little fluffy balls that pop out of their eggs, and within a couple of months are running around on the tundra looking like this. This bird has been left on the tundra by its parents, and it's about to head off on a migration to Argentina. How does it know where to go? One of the great mysteries of science. We think they're embedded genetically with a direction and a distance. That's all that they know. And they head out to do a remarkable journey. I'm going to show you a little visualization of what that journey looks like. And we're going to start in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So this is Alaska, and up along the north slope, which is the tundra area that borders the Arctic Ocean, is the habitats that these birds use. They're basically large grasslands. They're all wetland because of the water table being very high, basically because it's all underlain by permafrost. It would all be a desert without the permafrost keeping the water from percolating down through, but it ends up being a great place for shorebirds to nest. So in the Arctic Refuge, the chicks are born. In the fall, they start out on the first easy leg. They're just going to fly all the way across Canada and just sort of stretching their wings, getting the idea of what migration is like. They fly all the way across Canada to collect in some areas north of the Bay of Fundy. They use these blueberry barrens and large open landscapes. And their challenge there is to double their weight. For you or I to do that, we'd have to eat about 1,600 cheeseburgers in the course of a month. And they do this in the course of a few weeks, double their weight, and they use that fat to fuel the most remarkable part of their migration, a nonstop flight directly across the Atlantic Ocean. They come ashore in South America in places we don't know, travel by routes we don't understand across the interior of South America, and then spend the winter in the grasslands, in the pampas, where they can forage on the open habitats that are under a lot of conservation pressure down there too. So they're facing issues all throughout their life cycle. So here we are at Laguna Mar Chiquita. It's one of the important sites for shorebirds overwintering. It's winter for us, but of course it's summer down there. And after spending that part of the year, they get ready to come back by a completely different route, again, which no one's ever showed them. They follow up through the interior of South America, cross Central America, and come ashore in the Gulf Coast. And then this time of year, they use a different strategy. They'll use open farmland in places like the Quivira National Wildlife Refuge all the way up through the prairies. And they do what's called short hop migration. So they do shorter trips that don't require quite so much energy collection. And then they finish their migration moving north in this sort of shorter hop strategy all the way back now to, in some cases, the very spot where they started the year before on the tundra in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So that's what the birds are trying to do. It's a remarkable feat, and they do this round trip every year. Once they get back, they're really tired. Actually, this bird is doing a distraction display, trying to draw attention away from its nest. So they're not terrible parents. I don't want to leave you with the idea that they're really terrible parents. They do everything they can, including sometimes laying down their life for their chicks. But when it's time to go, they go, and the chicks are on their own. So I'm going to take you now on a little expedition to the Arctic Refuge and talk a little bit about the work we're doing there and the challenges of trying to sort of sense that remotely for the public. Up on the Arctic coast, there's the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And in Alaska, here we are, this is Alaska. You can see the Arctic Refuge is a very large piece of the corner of Alaska. In Alaska, everything's so big you have to compare it to some other state. So over in the west is the National Petroleum Reserve, which was set aside for its strategic petroleum resources. It's about the size of Indiana. Over on the east side is the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which is as big as South Carolina. And up on the coast is this small area called the 1002 area. It's what all the controversy's been about. It's the area that could be opened for oil exploration, but would require an act of Congress to do so, and is now in a status primarily for wildlife conservation. So that's where we're going to go, to the 1002 area, up here along the coast. And this is about the size of Delaware, so it's a pretty big place. To get there is a long process. We drive north across the Haul Road, which is about like driving from Louisiana to Minnesota, just driving up through Alaska. On the way, you pass my favorite Alaskan landmark, the farthest north spruce tree, with this very helpful environmental message from the Alaska Department of Transportation: do not cut. You have to tell people not to cut down trees like this in Alaska. People are using the environment very intensively. You get in a small plane to fly across the Brooks Range, and along the way you see evidence of climate change, like receding glaciers. And this place is so remote that most of these mountains have no name and have never been climbed. You come out across the mountains onto the coastal plain, and you touch down on what's supposed to be a frozen lake. Climate change is very real in the Arctic. This lake would normally be frozen this time of year. It's about a foot deep in slush, so when we landed on it and disappeared in a cloud of water, which wet us inside the plane, we rolled to a stop, and the pilot, who's a man of very few words, turned to me and said, "Bummer, dude." That was his way of saying he was never going to land here again, and we had to figure out a lot of other logistics to get the rest of the crew and the rest of the gear, and that's just sort of getting ready to start the work. It's a difficult place to get to. When you get out there and the snow starts to melt, this is the kind of habitat that the shorebirds are using. These are vast wetland, grassland areas. And they're very diverse, lots of different kinds of habitat, so really interesting different diversity that allows all these different bird species to coexist. It's a really beautiful landscape that in the short Arctic summer, the sun never goes down, so this is a midnight sun shot. We live in tents and have a lot of bad hair days because it's cold in the Arctic all the time, so you wear a hat all the time. That's a shot from late June. And we live in these little simple conditions while we're trying to do the work. So it's not a place that most people are going to want to go to. It's not a place that's easy to be. We managed over the course of 3 years to complete a survey by helicopter of the entire 1002 area and produce maps like this, which we've published, that show the distribution of these birds. So this is the American golden plover. Golden plovers are declining at an annual rate of about 7% a year. That's probably like your 401k over the last little bit. So it's not a good situation. They will go extinct in our children's lifetime if we don't figure out why they're declining. So it's very important to understand where they're nesting. It's also important that people understand those issues and what they can do while the birds are migrating. The other bird I talked about a little bit, the red-necked phalarope, uses very different kinds of habitats. It just collects in the wetlands along the coast, and so we're starting to understand what habitats they need. After they finish nesting, the second half of their sort of Arctic life cycle is equally important. The birds have to put on all that weight I mentioned before they can conduct that long migration. So they go out to the coast and use very rich intertidal areas along the coast. We started doing a survey of that part of their life cycle in the late summer in 2006. It involves covering about 138 miles of coastline. So as far as I know, there's no instrumentation that exists that could remotely sense what's going on in this environment. It's almost beyond the ability of a human observer to understand the variability at which these birds are using the landscape. They move very quickly from place to place in response to very short changes in water level that happen very quickly. So it's almost impossible for a human observer even to understand what they're doing. So what we're trying to do is conduct surveys across the area at all of these river delta segments to understand which ones are most important, because oil development offshore is actually allowed at the moment and is really just a question of logistics before it moves forward. So this is our research vessel for setting out in the Arctic Ocean. If you think we're crazy to head out in a little rubber boat into the Arctic Ocean, you're probably right. This fellow flipped this boat last summer and narrowly survived the experience, floating ashore upside down in a storm on the boat. Not a good place to be, but he managed to get ashore with his crew. Luckily, I wasn't in the boat that day. We go out on these coastal islands. This is the Arctic ice off in the distance. When I started the project in 2006, you could go 5 miles and see the Arctic ice cap. Last summer, it was about 220 miles offshore. So we're seeing very dramatic changes over a very short period of time in what's happening in the Arctic environments. We go out along the coast and camp at the edge of these river deltas, and this is an example of the kind of habitat. So at this particular site, there's about 17 miles of coastline that's very rich intertidal mudflat, some of which is very shallow and some of which is quite deep. And just physically getting to those places, most of these places no one has ever gone. There's no reason to go there other than to count shorebirds. So they're places where no one's ever been, no one's likely to go anytime soon, very difficult to get to, very difficult to sense. Meanwhile, there's all this activity offshore with the ice moving in and out and melting and changing the environment. As we go along the coast, we stop and set up our deluxe camp location, and we're sampling a whole range of things, including avian influenza, which you've probably heard a lot about. It's bird flu that may have a big impact on bird populations, but is not likely to transfer into humans, but important to study the progress of whether it's moving into this part of the world. So this is a juvenile red-necked phalarope we're testing for avian influenza. While you're going along the coast, there are other kinds of threats to worry about. This is a grizzly bear who thought that we were interesting. What a grizzly bear is supposed to do when it sees a person is run away, because we're big and scary and people hunt them. But as this one decided that we looked pretty tasty and actually attacked us in our boat. So there's 3 guys in a boat with a 90 horsepower engine running. This bear swam out into the river, tried to come at our boat. We went up shore, he went back to shore, ran down the river and came at us again, just unheard of bear behavior. We eventually used a little explosive device to send him in the other direction. But it's not a place that's easy to work, and it's not a place that most people want to go. So it's a challenge to work there. We did get out of that encounter without causing the bear any harm and without getting any harm caused to ourselves, and headed off down the coast. I mentioned that there are big changes from climate change. This is a storm that occurred last summer, and it just gives you a sense of the dynamic nature of this environment. This is permafrost, and this used to be a beach. So this is erosion on a grand scale, huge pieces of the Arctic tundra just falling off into the ocean. The reason that's happening is because there's huge fetch now. All that open water, the wind howling across it in a big Arctic storm, causes a lot of waves to form. Those 12-foot waves took out our boat and took out most of our equipment, and were difficult to survive. But we got through it and got the survey done. This is going to work on a typical day. So we park the boat and head ashore. That's me heading off to do a survey. You hope the boat's still there when you come back at the end of the day, because that's your lifeline. It's a nice Arctic day in August. It can snow any day of the year, and so you've probably been out in those conditions. But we're going home to a wet tent and spending the night sleeping in in a cold, wet tent. It's a difficult place to be. There's also a lot of polar bears in this environment. They're sort of the archetypal Arctic creature. We saw one bear in the first 2 years that we did this survey. I just got back 2 weeks ago from completing the survey, and we had 17 bears on the transects we were trying to survey. And they're coming ashore early now because their ice is melting out from underneath them. It's their habitat. And when it melts, there's nowhere for them to go, so they come on shore, they arrive hungry, and it makes for a lot of challenges just trying to avoid difficult interactions with bears. So we go to great lengths to avoid running into these guys. They'll actually stalk you. But it's a beautiful place, and the birds are managing to reproduce themselves, and they're coming then down from the Arctic into all these other environments where people need to understand what they're doing. So while we're out there in this vast Arctic environment, we're thinking about how do we communicate this? How do we provide information about this area to the public? The primary tool we've been using to do that is a live blog that we've been posting to directly from the Arctic. So that's the address if you're interested in checking it out. What we've done with this is post two kinds of things, the science that we're doing and the story behind the work. So we tell the story of the birds much like I'm telling you now. We tell the story of what it's like to work in the Arctic, and through those stories we try to involve people in the conservation issues. Most people, if they think about the Arctic Refuge, they'll think about what we call charismatic megafauna, things like polar bears, things like caribou. Many people who've heard of the Arctic Refuge can tell you the story that there's a vast herd of caribou, they have their calves there, they migrate in and out of the area. It's much harder to get people interested in all the other species that are there. There are 160 some odd bird species that we're trying to interest them in. So we found that by telling the stories remotely from the field live, we can create a kind of interest that draws people into these stories. So this is our our small list of equipment. We use a simple satellite phone. Everything has to be charged by solar power. The sun never sets when these birds are in this habitat, so solar power is the obvious way to go. And then we use a simple satellite messenger system to record the location that we are. So we post a podcast, file a location, and people can see exactly where we are, hear about what we're doing, and see how it's going. And this is just what that map looks like on the live location page. So it updates on a Google Earth map and shows people where we are. And then we can talk about what's found at that particular habitat, what species we've seen, what they're doing, and draw people into the story in that way. There's one other device I wanted to mention. It's this analog device called a book. I don't know if maybe some of you have heard of it. It's a really interesting device that you can look at pictures and text. And so I just mentioned this briefly because we felt that it was important to reach our audience in the terms that they know. And most birders really are interested in habitats and birds, and less so in conservation. Birders spend millions and millions of dollars buying top-end optics, but will in many cases be reluctant to pay a $3 fee to enter a particular site to look at the birds that are there. It's an ongoing struggle in the bird conservation world. So we're trying to reach out to birders in terms that they understand, and sometimes that's not electronic, sometimes it's adventure books. So we put together this book and tried to tell the story of the birds in the Arctic. And in addition to shorebirds, we talked about things like the northern wheatear, which leaves the Arctic Refuge and flies to Africa every year, or the Arctic tern, which circumnavigates the entire Atlantic Ocean annually in its migrations. And that was just another way of trying to draw people into the story and tell them what's going on. It has remarkable photography in it from some of the photographers who work in the Arctic, and that was another way to try to draw people into the story and get them sort of into the lives of those birds as they set out on their migration. And the last thing I want to mention is just there's been some discussion about citizen science. Manomet runs one of the oldest programs in citizen science for conservation that's called the International Shorebird Survey. And this is a large team of observers who go out and track shorebird populations. We just finished building a new web portal through eBird so that people can record their observations and also see what's been seen. The International Shorebird Survey has been running for 37 years across the country and actually across the entire hemisphere. And we just put up a new site where you can go and download the information from any particular site, find out what's there at the site, and find out whether a surveyor is needed. It's a major project, as all you know, to sort of maintain interest and participation in any of these citizen networks. So these kinds of products really help people see the results of their input, and that keeps them interested and active. And this is a very real conservation impact. The last point I want to make is that the International Shorebird Survey led directly to the formation of what we call the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. It's now 70 sites that span 10 countries, and Manomet coordinates this network of sites with all the countries involved. They're the major sites that the shorebirds use on their migrations. So for a shorebird leaving Alaska, it needs all of those sites to complete its life cycle. And so we're working directly on conservation of those sites across the hemisphere. Thanks very much.